You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Today we're talking about religious divorce and looking at how essential it is that family lawyers understand the cultural and religious backgrounds and diversity that comes with clients who are looking to divorce. I have Clizia Motterle, Senior Associate in the Family Team at RWK Goodman, based in Bath, and Farzana Iqbal, a family lawyer based at the Thames Valley office for RWK Goodman, talking to me about it today. It's great to have you both on the podcast. Thank you very much indeed for joining. I've done a very brief introduction to you both, but perhaps you might give me a little bit more of a background about your experience and expertise. Please, Clitzia first.
Thank you, David. As you said, I'm a senior associate in our Bath office at RWK Goodman. My practice crosses between matrimonial, so divorce and finances work, and private children work. And I also deal with domestic abuse cases.
Farzana.
Thank you, David. I'm a family solicitor in the Thames Valley team at Oxford for RWK Goodman. I deal with a wide range of matters concerning divorce, financial settlements and private children matters. This can also include areas such as separation agreements, cohabitation agreements, prenuptial and postnuptial agreements as well. So my practice is mainly privately based.
So it's an interesting subject today, religious divorce, not one that we've covered on the podcast before. And I guess from a layman's point of view, not one that I've particularly thought about, I must admit, in the past. Divorce is a legal process, not a religious process. I can see you nodding along, Clitzia. But tell us about what is a religious divorce in the first instance, please.
So a religious divorce is the dissolution of a marriage based on the rules of the particular religion that gave rise to the marriage in the first place, and it sits alongside the civil divorce. The specific rules which apply to the religious divorce will vary naturally according to the religion in question. For example, I'm a Christian, and for the purpose of this podcast, I've been thinking about how different Christian denominations would approach this. And there's a fundamental difference, for example, between the Church of England and the Catholic Church. With the Church of England, all you need is your civil divorce, and then your marriage is automatically dissolved in the church. The Catholic Church doesn't recognise divorce as a concept. So what somebody would need to do in order to get remarried in the church is obtain a decree of annulment or a nullity. And the criteria which underpin that process are completely different. They're based on canon law, and one would need to prove basically that the marriage wasn't valid in the first place. That can have all sorts of repercussions then on financial matters, children matters. Children are classed by the church still as legitimate children, even though they would have been conceived within what would have been determined as not a valid marriage in the first place. But it is considered to be what's called a putative marriage. The parents were considering that to be a valid marriage at the time the children were conceived and born, and that still makes the children legitimate. And it is all elements and considerations that don't necessarily apply or come up in the context of a civil divorce or how we would approach matters legally in the English and Welsh legal system. And I'm sure that other religions such as the Jewish faith or the Muslim faith will have different approaches again.
So I know, for example, Farzana, that you're Muslim, and as Clitzia has said, there's differences within even the Christian faith. What are the key things that we need to consider about Muslim divorce?
I think we need to look at the beginning as to how the marriage was formed in the first place. So when an Islamic marriage is formed, the parties enter into a marriage contract. It's called a nikah nama. and that will stipulate the main element being that a husband has to provide dowry to his wife. Upon a divorce, the husband is expected to fulfill that obligation to pay the dowry to his wife if he has not already done so during the marriage. So that's one of the differences. Whereas if they were conducting a civil divorce and that dowry came into question and it had not been fulfilled at that time, within a civil divorce, a husband could argue that it's not payable. I'm saying payable because usually the dowry is usually a form of cash, gold coins, or land property. So if that's not being fulfilled by the time of the divorce, there can be different approaches to that within a civil divorce compared to a religious one. Because as I said, in the religious divorce, it's an obligation that the husband has to pay or provide the dowry if he hasn't already done so during the marriage.
I guess a few kind of things come out of what you've both said. One for me is whether religion, and this is an existential question, I think, rather than one for our podcast, but how out of touch are religious practices in the 21st century with legal practice? So you've both talked about the practicalities of what needs to happen within a religious divorce, but they're quite different from civil proceedings.
I don't feel like it's out of touch, because I think someone who's going through Islamic divorce, all they're sort of thinking about, the forefront of their mind is what is the religious guidelines, what has been set out for me, what do I need to follow religiously. So that's all set out usually by the Holy Book or the Islamic Sharia councils. So I think, as I said, I think the forefront of their mind will be to follow the guidelines and the rules and regulations that are set out therein. They're not really going to be thinking about what society thinks how a divorce should be conducted or what needs to be taken into account.
Is that your experience as well, Clitzia?
I think there's definitely a separation between a distinction more than a separation between secular and religious society. You know, we talk about in Christianity about not being of the world and being set aside from the world, but certainly from a legal perspective and bringing it back to what we're talking about in divorce, I think is more about having a sensitivity to those issues in the background and being aware that not everyone will approach divorce in the same way, and that people will go through a separation and a relationship breakdown in all sorts of different ways, whether they are religious or not. I suppose being religious just adds a layer of complication or a different aspect, because there could be some more resistance to the breakdown of the marriage in the first place. There could be some, not stigma, but some within the culture, within the community, this could have said, it could be frowned upon more than in the secular society. So there is certainly something that we need to bear in mind as lawyers when we approach clients that we know feel particularly strongly about their religion. And sometimes you will know because they tell you. I have referrals, people that come to me because they are part of a certain community and they know that I am as well. So I'll be able to help them perhaps in a different way than the average person, if I can say that. And sometimes you just need to ask the right questions to try and understand whether or not that is something that is important to them, in the same way as questions could be asked around other topics.
Do you feel that your own experience and your own views help you in your work then?
I would say so. I think it helps relating, empathizing with clients and understanding perhaps aspects that somebody who was more secular wouldn't understand as relevant or so relevant. For example, I mentioned the Catholic Church and how you can't have a divorce, strictly speaking. So you might have a situation where one of the spouses is at the receiving end of the other person's decision, and it can be difficult to accept that marriage is breaking down in the first place. So before you even start talking about children, talking about financial aspects, you need to understand that this is a person that may be struggling with the concept of a divorce in the first place.
And is that something that you find as well, Farzana, in your own community?
Yes, I mean, in my community, as I mentioned, I am from a religious background. I am a Muslim, so, I do day-to-day meet clients, just generally meet people from my community who I feel they can better approach me to ask questions about relationships and separation and divorce, just even generally. And I think I do tend to get the clients that are from a similar background or similar religious identity to me, find that they have more of a sort of natural affinity towards me and me dealing with it, because I would probably have a better understanding of what they're dealing with, but also the impact of a divorce on the community, within the religious community. So I do find does happen. I think it's important that us lawyers do have an awareness of people's religious backgrounds, cultural backgrounds from the initial meeting, and I do make an effort or take time to really get to know my client at that first meeting, and making sure that I do have a full backstory, history of their identity, just their own story. From that I can gauge, whether I need to consider not just the legal process, but the religious process as well of divorce.
You've both identified that there are some inconsistencies between what the religion says and then what the law says. How can we reconcile that? It sounds really tricky from your point of view.
It's undoubtedly difficult to reconcile the inconsistencies. There will be certain inconsistencies that can be reconciled, and some that just have to be accepted, in my view. And one thing I have experienced is a situation where people are perhaps on a different stage of their faith journey in a couple. Both parties start out as secular, for instance, and then you have a husband or a wife who has remained such, but the other person has moved on. And particularly when children are born, that can become quite tricky in agreeing what the children will be exposed to and how they will be brought up as far as religion is concerned. Throw in the mix the breakdown of a relationship, and you can see how that can become quite a difficult situation. I have had cases where that has been quite prominent. I'm talking from experience in that respect. One example that I can think of is where two people were of two different Christian denominations, that the tradition within one of them was to baptize children as soon as possible after they're born. The other one expects children to go through their own faith journey and then decide whether or not to be baptized when they are old enough to understand. And that is an inconsistency that legally a court, if we was before the court, the judge would need to determine what's in the best interest of the child. But how do you determine that legally? Because if you take away completely the religious aspect, there is no difference in the life of the child whether they are baptized or not. It goes down to your belief. That's why I said it might be that this is an inconsistency that can't be reconciled. A judge sitting in court would say, well, what is in the best interest of the child depends on what your belief structure is, because if you were completely secular, all of this would be meaningless.
Just taking the example of an Islamic marriage again, and an Islamic divorce, usually upon a divorce where the children are concerned, there are rules and guidelines which say that for minor children, the children should stay with the mother. For a boy, it is up until the age of 7, and for a girl, it is up to the age of 9. So knowing that there are those guidelines in place, usually that's what the parties want to follow, and that there are reasons why they're in place. Whereas in a civil divorce or civil children proceedings, private proceedings, there's no presumption of any parent having care of the children. So it's usually from an equal sharing, 50-50 sort of starting point, whereas that is different under Islamic law. So again, I just think it just comes back down to people's beliefs. So they might consider, well, this is what the law says. In this country, the law says there's a starting position of 50-50, but we don't think that that's in the best interest of our children and in accordance with our beliefs. So we would prefer, or we would favour, to follow what our religion says, and that which says that the mother is the primary carer up until a certain age, and when they reach maturity, then either children can make the decision of where they want to live, which parent they want to live with, or the parties can come to a mutual agreement between themselves about where the children are going to stay, who are they going to stay with. Even if the children are staying with the mother, for example, in those early minor years, that doesn't mean that the father doesn't have any rights. He still has visitation rights. It's just who is going to have the day-to-day care of the children. So I just find I have found this in the past where there has been disagreements about child arrangements. The parties have looked to, well, what does my religion say about this? Because it's in direct conflict with what the law says in this country, in England and Wales. So I think it's right what Clizia said. Sometimes there just can't be a reconciliation. You can't reconcile the two because one just trumps the other due to their beliefs.
So Clitzia, I want to come to you on domestic abuse in just a second, but just as a follow-up question to that, Farzana, is it more likely that you're going to get an out-of-court settlement than in a religious case? Because if you go to court, you're going to end up having to follow the rule of the land.
Yeah, especially in the early stages of the separation, divorce as well. The Islamic Sharia Council encourage mediation. They encourage reconciliation, in fact, as well, just in case the parties get back together again. They really try their best to make sure that it's amicable and that people mediate and try to come to out-of-court settlements or use other alternative dispute resolution methods. And it's what we do as well. Again, going back to that initial meeting, is court's a last resort. We always advise clients there are other ways of resolving a dispute. You don't have to, go down the court route. There is mediation and counselling available, and that's what the Islamic Sharia Council offer as well. They offer a counselling service as well as a divorce service. So I think that's really beneficial for clients as well.
And Clitzia, I know you want to talk about the potential for domestic abuse in these circumstances. Can you expand on that, please?
Yes, domestic abuse can manifest in all sorts of different ways. But again, as I was thinking about this podcast, it came to mind how religion can be used as a way to perpetrate certain dynamics. And there is perhaps the more stereotypical ones of women being subjected to all sorts of practices. But I have experienced more subtle ones. If I go back to the example of one party being more secular than the other, but being familiar with the religion that the other person follows, if you have a dynamic when the secular person is the perpetrator and the person who is more religious is the victim, they can undermine their religion as a form of control. And I'm thinking back to a particular case where I was acting for the victim in that scenario, and she was engaging in certain completely normal religious practices at home and involving her children, which were completely twisted and manipulated by the other person to present them as something a lot more sinister than what they were, ultimately to try and prevent her from being able to express her religious freedom in that way and involve her children. And again, it is something that as family lawyers, we really need to be mindful of. A lot of my work involves domestic abuse, representing victims, representing alleged perpetrators as well. And it is quite a topical aspect of our work. We are all told to be mindful, courts are told to be mindful. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is this is just another way in which we need to be sensitive to our clients' needs, meet them where they are, and really take the time, as Farzana was saying, to get to know them, to understand what's important to them and what actually is going on. And once you've done that, in my experience at least, you build better rapport with them, but also you can provide better service and hopefully reach an agreed resolution without the need to have conflict. And you can tailor your advice based on what you know is important to them. For example, when compromise might need to be made.
What I'm getting from this discussion is that we've got to be mindful of the way in which people want to be treated, and we have to respect their own thoughts about something that's important to them. I think the fact that you both bring your own experiences to the table is really important. We're moving towards the end of the time we have for the discussion, but I did want to touch on the change in the legislation that was enacted last year in April, so-called no-fault divorce, and the potential impact on this inconsistency, I suppose, this challenge that we have around religious divorce and the sort of legal proceedings. Have you seen a particular impact of that change in legislation on religious divorce, Clitzia?
From a civil perspective, the no-fault divorce is a huge improvement compared to the blame, if I can use that way, approach that we had before. But again, going back to the inconsistencies that can't be reconciled, admittedly, only in a couple of situations, but I've had people have come to me and said, and we're quite surprised that people could simply get divorced without the need to find the reason or find blame for the breakdown of the marriage. And it can be felt as if the sanctity of marriage, the importance of that bond, was being undermined somewhat, because the perception could perhaps be that it becomes too easy, in inverted commas, to get divorced. And obviously we know that that's not the case, and that generally has been a very important and useful way to take out the heat and make sure that any negotiations about children, about finances, take place in a more amicable way without the need to think about adultery, think about behaviour like we used to have to. But again, I go back to meeting the client where they are and thinking about the person that you are talking to. Sometimes I may say to a client, oh, we don't need to think about divorce, that's almost an administrative process. And whilst to somebody who is not religious, they would just acknowledge that and move on, that can be quite difficult to accept to somebody who is religious. So being almost dismissive of the divorce process is not the right thing to do.
I agree with what Clizia said about that. You know, where there is a religious divorce or a religious marriage and a civil marriage, so there's going to be a religious divorce and a civil divorce. So that obviously does make it easier, the no-fault divorce being in effect. But where the religious divorce is concerned, that hasn't changed. So again, taking the Islamic divorce, you still have to give a reason. There's still a specific criteria that needs to be met. You still have to give a reason for the divorce. The only one ground that you have to satisfy under a civil divorce is that the marriage is broken down irretrievably. You don't have to give any reason at all. And that's great if you're going through the civil process, but with the religious process under Islamic law, you still have to give a reason. There's different ways to divorce if you're the man or the woman. And again, similarly in the Jewish marriage as well, going through that process of the religious divorce is really important, because only the man can divorce his wife, and if they both consent. If the wife is unable to get her husband's consent, we need to be thinking about things that we need to put in place to make sure that he does provide his consent to that divorce. For example, there is a standard clause that is put in financial orders, undertakings and promises that a man gives that he will provide his wife with the get. So that's an important consideration that needs to be considered, especially in that situation in the Jewish divorce, because it's not easy for a woman to obtain a divorce outright. They still have to follow their own religious principles and guidelines as well. So yeah, whilst it's easier in the civil divorce, it's no different or no easier in the religious divorce process.
And of course, one thing we haven't touched on today is that you can have a religious marriage without being legally married in England and Wales as well. I mean, that perhaps makes things slightly easier.
This is very common within my culture and within my religion in Islamic marriage. So when a couple get married and they've entered into the nikah, which is the marriage contract, as far as they're concerned, that's the start of their marriage, but that's all that is required. They don't see the necessity for a civil marriage because, as far as they're concerned, they're married under in the eyes of God. So I know in my experience, I know a lot of people that are married that don't have the civil marriage simply because they don't see the need for it. But what they don't know is that if that relationship broke down, they wouldn't have the automatic rights that a husband or a wife would have in accordance with a civil divorce. So yeah, again, these are all differences that could be reconciled, and people that are in those situations that have just a religious marriage, I would urge them to consider setting out their agreements, for example, setting out a cohabitation agreement, because they're effectively known as cohabitees. So they could enter into a cohabitation agreement to regulise their arrangements that can go alongside their marriage contract.
And Clitzia, you were nodding along as well there.
Yes, I think linking back to the last point that Farzana made, what perhaps individuals don't recognise when they enter into a religious marriage that isn't then converted into a civil marriage alongside it, the only protection, if I can use that word, that they would have on a breakdown of relationship are the remedies that are available to cohabitees. So somebody could legitimately believe that they are married because they have gone through a religious process within their community, but they're not in the eyes of the law, and that could leave them quite vulnerable, especially in situations where you have one party who is the homemaker, and say at the end of a long civil marriage, they would have a right to sharing into the other person's pension that they would have built up during the marriage. That's not the case in a scenario where a religious marriage that hasn't been made into a civil marriage breaks down because there is that remedy is not available to cohabitees.
The only other remedy they would have available is, and this is both in sort of the Jewish context and the Islamic context, is when they get married, they enter into a marriage contract. So their remedy would be to, if there was a dispute, is to argue a breach of contract. So that is the way that they would enforce that contract.
Cohabitation is a completely different issue, and one that is reserved for another podcast, no doubt, because it is an equally sizable issue to contend with. I think what I've taken away from today is the importance of just understanding your clients. As ever, as family lawyers, we have to understand what our clients are going through. We have to understand some of their motivations. And as I said at the start, I don't think religion is something that is automatically one of the first things we think about, but clearly has a huge impact on the way in which people behave during a divorce. So thank you very, very much indeed for joining the podcast. The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on today'sfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Clitzia, thank you also to Farzana, and thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at today'sfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.